and this is a very interesting conversation about Michael Jackson and about specifically the Captain EO experience and the feature film career that might have been. And the guest that we're speaking to now, his name is Rusty Lemorande, and he's the producer of films like Yentl, and he wrote Electric Dreams, which is currently actually being remade. Plans are underway to remake Electric Dreams, which we just spoke about that movie last week.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, and this is a really fascinating interview. I hope you guys enjoy it. This is Rusty Lemorande. Let me ask you first how this project came about for Captain EO.
I think the most important part was that Disney suddenly had new management. It's kind of well known that Michael Eisner, and Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg came over to Disney from Paramount and Warner Brothers. And the idea was to re-energize Disney, which was not doing very well as a film studio. Sort of was separate from the rest of Hollywood. And one of the first things they decided was to integrate the various divisions. At that time, the theme park division was utterly distinct from the film division. And the three gentlemen I mentioned did a survey and thought, there's quite a bit of talent at the theme park division, particularly with, character design and animatronic design. And so the new management, Eisner, Katzenberg, and Wells, thought they could, in fact, use that team for special effects in films, etc.
Right.
That didn't work out very well. We found that out in Captain EO. But they also knew that both George Lucas and Michael Jackson were huge fans of the theme park. Lucas famously, as a college student, spent a lot of weekends there, wandering around, self-described nerd who felt comfortable there. And Michael Jackson was famous for repeated visits in disguise, etc. So the three men I mentioned put their heads together and said, hey, we could do something very exciting for the park if we could get George Lucas and Michael Jackson to do an event,
right? Some
kind of attraction. And Disney already had an attraction there called Magic Journeys, which was a large format 3D short film, which was apparently very successful. I recall it was basically travel footage through mountains, through cities. It was an amusement park with carousels, etc.
Yeah.
But at that time, 3D, had basically disappeared. So the perfection of that system, because it was double 65 millimeter cameras, at a time when if you saw 3D in a cinema, it was basically a 35 millimeter print cut in half with two effectively 16 millimeter images overlapped, so the quality was terrible. So they approached Michael and George, who were pretty excited about it, both loving new technology and trying new things. And the Disney theme park people came up with three premises for the ride, for the attraction. One was Michael would be on some kind of iced environment with a witch ice queen. Seemed to me it was kind of out of Lion, Witch, in the Wardrobe, and he would combat that creature. Another was that Michael would stay in the park after hours, and hide on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and so that would be the 3D adventure. And the third one was that Michael would be a space voyager who used music to turn bad and evil into good, and would combat some wicked person, some kind of villain. Sorry.
That's okay.
And combat villain with music. So that's the one Michael liked. George liked that one, and that's where I entered the picture. Apparently George said, we need to find a producer-writer, someone who can work with celebrities, because Michael might be difficult. George had really no background with that. And George had a lot of other projects. So I had just finished Yentl, producing that, doing rights and writing on that. And I'd also written and produced a film called Electric Dreams, which had a lot of effects, etc. So Disney flew me in from Spain. I was actually researching a musical on the life of Goya. I was hustled in very quickly. It was all top secret. But I went up to Lucas Ranch, met with him. It was very exciting for me. And I think the main reason I got the job was I had been developing a feature film in 3D, a space film, which meant I had a lot of background, a recent background in 3D technology. And two, I had a history with Disneyland. I had done my senior thesis on a comparative study of Disneyland and Coney Island, how the theme park business had changed over those decades. And I said to him, I remember saying, hey, if Walt Disney were alive, he wouldn't just put a 3D movie in the theater, he'd put interactive theater effects.
Yeah.
And George said, what do you mean? And I said, well, he'd have the seats move, and he'd have smoke when there's explosions, and he'd put stars in the walls, and he'd find every way that the 3D could become more dimensional, kind of like a 4D effect. And George said, that's great, we got to do that, and you've got the job. So that began the process, and I recall the first meeting with Michael Jackson. I was very nervous and concerned that I would show my shyness, because I knew from experience with Barbra Streisand that when you get to be that big a celebrity, you hate it when people don't look you in the eye, which people do. And so I had been taught early on that you need to look a celebrity right in the eye, otherwise, sort of like an animal instinct, they feel you're not strong enough to work with them. It was easy because Michael always wore sunglasses at that time. For some reason, that was his style. I think it was to be in control in a sense, that everybody had to look at him, but nobody knew if he was looking at them. And we kind of hit it off. We became very close friends. And partly because George was very busy with Howard the Duck at the time and the Ewok movie, and he was helping repair the sequel to The Wizard of Oz, which was in a lot of trouble that Disney had acquired. And a couple of other projects. We didn't see much of him. We hadn't hired a director yet. In the classic sort of old studio style, we developed the project without knowing who our director would be. And there was an assumption that it would be a quick job, like a rock video.
Right.
This was only meant to be about 15 minutes, that it could be like a week shoot. George said, well, we'll ask Spielberg first. We have to give him the first opportunity, partly because Michael had a close relationship with him. Of course, George did. And he passed right away. And then George said, well, what about Francis? Of course, they were very close. That's kind of historically well documented. And Disney didn't want to do it. At that point, Francis, was considered, he had all the problems with One from the Heart, etc. So they were very nervous about him. Michael raised concerns, saying, what does he know about rock videos? What does he know about special effects? Both of which were sort of at the heart of Captain EO. But I remember George saying, and I was quite impressed by it, he said, look, Francis is a bona fide artist. He's the real McCoy. And if you're a real artist, you can do anything. And George also, of course, gave the assurances that he would make sure that if Francis didn't deliver on some level, he would step in a sense. And so Francis was hired, but the script had already been written. I had written the first draft, which everybody seemed happy with. And but then, of course, Francis, like any writer-director, wanted to do his polish. But he didn't change much. It was mostly dialogue in the first half of the project, and if anyone's seen it,
right.
It's basically two halves. There's the part in the spaceship where you meet the crazy stuffed animal characters that are Michael's team, Captain EO's team, and then they get the distress call, and they land on the dark, sinister planet. And then the second half is meeting the Angelica Houston witch, getting in trouble, getting out of trouble, using music and dance, and then the big dance sequence, and then, of course, the concluding dance sequence.
Coppola was recently interviewed, and he gave a statement about Michael Jackson and said that there was such a childlike glee and excitement to him on that set. Did you find that to be the case?
Mike, absolutely. And the secret of working with Michael was to literally think, how would you deal with, a 10-year-old boy?
Mm.
Francis got it. I mean, at one point, I remember this distinctly. He was having trouble directing Michael. Michael didn't seem to respond to the kind of normal word dialogue that a director largely uses. And Francis is brilliant at it. I mean, he just has a wonderful way with actors, but it wasn't working. So he literally sent out for some masks, happy masks like clown masks and scary masks. And when he wanted to elicit an emotion from Michael, he would literally put on one of the masks, and it would be as if a child were reacting to a mask.
Yeah.
And it was effective. I mean, I'm not saying that was every moment, but it was certainly, there were moments. I mean, in some ways, I don't think Francis used that technique enough. Because he used to say to me, I'm not getting through to Michael. He seems to have such a rapport with you, and, what can I do? And I was a little embarrassed. I said, well, you need to go out with him and go toy shopping. You need to hang out with him and play some video games, because that was basically how I got to know him. He loved to go toy shopping. And but then the adult in him wanted to drive his car, and he drove like a maniac. I mean, a very effective driver, but I was always like gripping my seat. And he had masks. He loved to have masks in his glove compartment, which he would put on as he drove. And his explanation was, well, if I don't put it on, people will see it's me and they'll chase me.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought, well, if you put a gorilla mask on or something in the car, they might chase you for that reason. I sensed he just enjoyed it. He just really enjoyed the playfulness of it. Then we go into a toy store. He had his favorites, and I knew most of them. I kind of collect little toys. So some of them were collectible toy stores. He loved the last Wound-Up on Melrose Avenue, for example. And it was funny because then he would wear a mask. The mask he'd wear into the store would usually be like a woman's harem mask kind of thing,
right,
with a veil across his face. So it was always very awkward for me that I'd go in there and they'd look at me like, who are you with this sort of unidentified harem man? Because Michael was very tall and very, he had a very mannish body, and his hands were huge, and he walked, with a very confident mannish way, but then he'd have this girl's harem mask on. So I kept thinking, oh my God, if they only knew, they'd stop staring at me as this weirdo who walked around with this guy. But that was the secret. And when I'd meet with him, I'd meet at his house. It was in Encino at the time, where his parents still lived, which was like a miniature version of what later became Neverland, with twinkling lights and all the trees and animated displays and windows and a small zoom in the back. And we would often meet in his bedroom, which was so huge it was really more like a suite. It was could be like a house for some people. But he had paintings of Walt Disney and endless shelves of toys and mannequins and video games. And if you dealt with him on that level, the communication was ideal. Mm. But if you tried to deal with him like an adult, he wasn't rude and he wasn't difficult. It just was clear it wasn't getting to his heart, so to speak.
Right.
But that way, so I've always felt that the portrayal of Michael as a young man in an adult body was not a creation. It was actually genuine and true. On the other hand, if there was a tough business decision, and there were a few, he could become an adult very quickly. It was almost like a split personality, a little spooky in that way.
Actually, he would have to.
It was a switch, and you'd literally see his eyes switch. I mean, it was a little spooky, as I said. You'd see a change in his face, and he'd suddenly become an adult, and he'd deal with the adult matter, the legal matter, the business matter, and then kind of revert back to the child.
Did you have any run-ins with him after the Captain EO experience?
Yeah, I knew him for the subsequent 25-some years. He really enjoyed the process we had, and we got very, very close during post-production because the thing had a lot of problems in the shooting. It wasn't just a week shoot. It wasn't enough. It was one of those things that kind of got saved in post-production.
Yeah.
But also, George Lucas pointed out most of his projects, which are so special effects dependent, the first cuts are pretty disastrous.
Yeah.
He told that to his staff. He said, if you'd seen the first cut of Indiana Jones, if you'd seen the first cut of Star Wars, you'd think it was a bomb. And the first cut of Captain EO, we kind of thought it would be cut very quickly because it was only, again, 15 minutes. But it was one of the longest post-production schedules I've ever been part of. And part of the problem was it really had to be a rock video. And it was shot much more in a grand kind of theatrical style, and there just weren't enough cuts. There weren't enough edits and a lot of other issues. So there was a tremendous amount of additional shooting. Francis had already gone on to another film. The contract we had with him is we only had him for 2 weeks because he already had signed to do Peggy Sue Got Married. So literally they monitored him on the set the last few days and took him away. And so all the post was done sort of like, again, the old style movies where a director comes in, he directs the actors, and then you go off with your editors and your special effects people and your producer, in this case me. But Michael got very involved in that process, and I used to bring him cuts, and he'd get happier. He was very upset initially, and he said, this is what happens when you have, a director really needs to know pop promos and TV videos, whatever you want to call them. But as we added all these shots and did the reshooting and cut the thing and, started using shots in ways they weren't intended, as post-production allows, you can flip them, and mirror them, and you can sometimes use a tail of a shot where an actor moves and you didn't, you thought it was cut. It's amazing what you can do in post if you open your mind to that. And he was very involved in post-production. And he claimed that that's, in fact, what he had done on Thriller and also on Bad, where he felt the things had really emerged in the post-production process. So then Michael was pretty pleased with our relationship, and he had just set up his film company at Sony, Columbia. And the problem was with all the development people, et cetera, and it was a pretty, thick company with people, he wasn't committing to anything. And I think people just really didn't understand how to react, how to relate to him, how to make him understand what a film could be, and I think also finding the right films. Because I used to say to him, you're a little bit like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You can't do any part. The part has to be tailored to you. He became a star because of Terminator. Famously a part that they didn't think he was right for. They wanted him to play the good guy. He said, no, I don't speak English that well. I need to play the bad guy, and of course the rest is history. So Michael said, well, you come up with some ideas. And I came up with two fairly quickly. One was to remake an old film called The Seven Faces of Dr. Lau, which was an old Tony Randall film that involved a child protagonist. It's basically a Pied Piper story where a weird guy who takes on 7 different personalities through animation, etc., comes to a small town with a circus. And the other was to remake the film Angels with Dirty Faces, which is basically a James Cagney film. Michael was a huge James Cagney fan, who has a gang of kids and again, a famous film that's been parodied and, in a sense, remade in many ways. And Michael loved both projects. Part of it was the way I explained it to him and talked him through it. And we had sketches done on one and creatures made. You really had to sort of turn it into the toy version. On Dr. Lau, we had set miniatures built of the circus. And he committed to both, which was a major event at the time, that Michael would actually commit to projects. And one was set up at Warner's, and the other was set up at Turner, who owned the remake rights. And everything was going great. Fantastic. We were going to have 2 films with Michael. And then the first scandal hit. I remember as vividly as I remember, where I was when I heard President Kennedy was shot. I was in my car driving to the small studio where we were building these miniatures, where people were going to come and actually see them. And someone called me and said, did you hear what's on the news? Michael Jackson's ranch has been raided. That was the first accusation. And if you recall, Michael was quickly on his way to Japan for the first stop on his tour. And they sent me to Japan to bring the miniatures. They were very concerned that he was deeply depressed and that if he saw these miniatures, if he saw these toys, which were quite wonderful, I mean, they really were brilliantly executed and perfect for describing to him, and again, this childlike way, what this film could be. But they said this is to kind of keep him positive, because right now he's thinking his world is over.
Yeah.
And I flew there, and that's a long story in itself, what happened when I got there, but it worked the charm. He couldn't have been more delighted and happy and committed. But the truth of the matter is, put very simply, you know, and in fairness to Hollywood and the big studios, they have huge investment obligations to their shareholders. So they got very nervous. They didn't know if the audience would still be there for Michael.
Yeah.
So all the excitement about making films with him, where at that time if Michael committed to a film, any studio would have jumped, as they did with the two projects he committed to, the two that I brought to him. Suddenly nobody wanted to touch him. And it wasn't like forever. It was, well, we'll wait and see what happens. Because, of course, at that time it was a serious allegation. You may recall he never showed up in Mexico. The assumption was he was going to be arrested there. Whether that's true or not, he didn't show up for his Mexico concert. He suddenly disappeared, and for a month nobody knew where he was. He was calling me repeatedly during that time. I knew he was in Europe because he'd joke and say, the sun is just coming up. He wouldn't tell me where he was. I didn't press the matter. But he'd say, the sun is just coming up, and it would be a certain time in L.A., so I knew that that was European time. And to put it briefly, the Warner Brothers project ended completely, but then he acquired the rights, partial rights, to Dr. Lowe. That's a complicated. I mean, a lot of times films don't get made because of complex underlying rights problems. You may know that Spider-Man, for example, for years was tied up in bankruptcy court.
Yeah.
James Cameron was going to direct it. So there were Dr. Lowe problems because the rights were co-owned by George Powell, who made the original film, and well, it turned out Turner because they had acquired the library. So why Dr. Lowe never gave me, but we hired Stan Winston, and we had music commissioned and written by Giorgio Moroder. It was quite exciting, and you know, I have to tell you, quite sad that it never happened, because it was very important for Michael to be in movies. He used to talk about Elvis Presley's career and say, you know, if Elvis hadn't made all his films, he wouldn't be as remembered as he was, and he really wanted a film career.
What do you think?
Really
what kind of
shame that it didn't happen.
What kind of film career do you think he could have had without all of these complications that arose?
Well, he would have made Dr. Lowe, and it could have been another Grease. You know, I think it would have been remarkable. It was a wonderful story. And if any of your listeners watched the old movie and imagine an updated version, we set it in inner city and modernized it. If you look at Angel's Dirty Faces and imagine a musicalized version of that, you'll see, you know, all it takes is 2 or 3 hits to have a film career, so to speak.
Right.
I mean, for all we talk about Schwarzenegger or Barbra Streisand or even Brad Pitt, you know, it's Tom Cruise. It's usually 2 or 3 hits, and all the rest are good movies, but not.
And he was already the biggest star on the planet, so I mean, he had that going for him before he even entered the filmmaking world.
I think it's a global tragedy that it never happened, because of course, one reason we remember Marilyn Monroe and Judy Garland and James Dean is because of their movies that live on forever.
Yeah.
So it's a very personal tragedy for me, and I think the world lost something that they'll never know. Yeah,
I was going to ask you about that, and then I'll let you go. You've been so generous to give of your time today to us. When you heard that he had passed, what were your initial thoughts, and what were your thoughts on what the world has lost with that talent?
Well, 2 things surprised me. One was how sad I was, because I liked Michael a lot, and I felt I was part of a group he trusted and respected, and anytime I wanted to see him, it would take a few days to get the meeting arranged, but sometimes he'd fly me in to see him. I flew all over the world during those 20 years meeting with him, because that was easier for him than waiting until he was in L.A. And I, you know, as an adult, I don't think I ever was a close friend. I think you really had to be young to be that close, but in the sense I would bring out whatever I could remember of my youth and speak on that level, I think we were pretty close. But I was surprised how much I felt a loss, almost like a family member. And then I noticed how everyone was feeling a loss. And it struck me that, you know, funny thing happens in a world culture. we bond with our celebrities in ways we don't even recognize. I mean, I had gotten so used to, if someone heard that I'd worked with Michael, I'd hear all the negativity, and all the pessimism, and all the insinuations from anybody, young or old. And I defended to the extent I could. I mean, I only knew what I knew, and I never saw any signs of inappropriate behavior. And I believe in our legal system, and he was acquitted, so he should be treated like an acquitted individual. But it just wore me down. And then suddenly he passes away, and it's almost like the world forgets all that and is reminded how much he contributed to their lives and how magical his existence made us feel about the potential for human beings. So I'm just really impressed and a little bit stunned at the broad public warmth and sadness. Yeah. I've never seen that before. And then finally I felt a very personal failure. I mean, as much as I tried to get these films made, and there are a couple of others with not as much time dedicated, I kept thinking, what could I have done? Where could I have pushed a little harder, made a few more phone calls? Because it wasn't easy working with Michael, and this is going to come out more and more, he kept changing management. I don't think he was that trusting. Mm. And every time you have a new management, you have to, as a producer, writer, you have to start all over again, winning them over. Convincing them the project is valid. And each time he had a new group, I could do that, but it was difficult. And you almost wished it were the old Hollywood system where the star was on contract and they were just told what to do. Because Michael, could have made, I'm repeating myself here, but he should have made 3 or 4 movies. Yeah. It's a loss to him. It was very important to him. He talked about it constantly. And I think it lost to society and culture. It really is, and I'm as a 35-year-old man. I was those were formative years when he came around, when he really blew up in the early mid '80s, and I feel like that chunk of my kind of childhood innocence is it's gone in a way. It's difficult for me to express, but it really did draw upon a lot of sadness for me as well when I heard Thursday evening. I'm not surprised to hear that because I think we all felt that without realizing the potential. But until until somebody's gone, whether it's family member or friend, you don't really realize what they meant to you. I'm just stunned and so impressed that the world feels that loss. It's really a testimony to